There we go. Well, hello. So now we'll start. I'm Ashley Wilms. I'm the Executive Director of Kentucky Resources Council. We are a statewide environmental law and policy organization. 2026 marks our 42nd year of working to protect Kentucky's natural resources, our environment, our communities, and our people. And each year, the Kentucky General Assembly considers hundreds of bills that shape our environment, our economy, and our communities, sometimes for the better, but unfortunately, often for the worse. And each year, KRC is there throughout the session to track bills, provide comprehensive legal analysis on issues of concern, and advocate for policies that support healthy communities and a healthy environment for all Kentuckians. We have broken down the outcomes of the 2026 Kentucky General Assembly regular session into the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll be sending that report to all of you, I think, by the end of next week. But today we're going to go through most of those key bills and talk about the highlights of what passed, what failed, and what all of it means for Kentucky's people and environment. So yeah, the 2026 session was a budget year and it was a long 60-day legislative session. As Audrey will go into, it was very, very long. Um, so on that, I actually want to introduce KRC's primary lobbyist, Audrey Ernstberger. While Audrey and I are both legislative agents for KRC, Audrey is the one that is primarily on the ground in Frankfort. She's regularly testifying before legislative committees and talking to our legislators about bills of concern. She did a really great job this year in the hot seat during those committees, testifying against bills that we were concerned about and answering questions really well. So thank you for that, Audrey. As we're going along today, please feel free to place questions in the chat. We will get to, we may stop and address some of those as we go along, but if not, we'll make sure we get to all of those questions at the end. So with Audrey, with that, I will let you start us off.
Thank you so much, Ashley. It's always a pleasure to be on a KRC team, working with some excellent teammates. And I know that super well working with the legislature. We always take feedback from each other and move forward in opposing bills or promoting them. So, that being said, we're going to start with the good section. This year, I have the pleasure of announcing that there were several good bills that we can talk about today and that actually made it through session. We supported a number of bills that we believe will have a positive impact on the environment. And like I said, this is the welcome shift from sessions past. The first one we're going to start with is SB 49. Slide, please. SB 49 takes on the challenge of how to safely dispose of batteries. When batteries are thrown away improperly, it can actually create some real problems, especially in terms of public safety and public health. They can cause small fires, for example, if they're not disposed of properly. And also their environmental concerns. When batteries are in the waste stream, then they make it to the landfill, they can break down and end up leaching corrosive and toxic substances into the soil and water. So actually keeping them out of the waste stream is pretty helpful. SB 49 handles this issue by issuing a statewide ban on the improper battery disposal and then creates a voluntary program that was also supported by industry, actually, that would be overseen by the Energy and Environment Cabinet. And part of that goal is to educate folks on how to properly dispose batteries and help prevent this issue. So we saw quite a few of animal welfare and agricultural bills this year, some of which were good and then some of which were problematic. But Senate Bill 155 happens to be one of the good ones. And it would allow the Commissioner of Agriculture, along with the state vet, excuse me, to declare an animal health emergency and then exercise emergency powers to control a communicable animal disease. This would include things like imposing quarantines, waiving certain transportation requirements, establishing roadblocks, and then bypassing standard procurement rules, and then requesting state, local, or federal emergency assistance. So, for example, if there were an outbreak of a highly contagious disease at a poultry farm, for example, like the avian flu. When something like that happens, a disease could spread really rapidly from farm to farm, from animal to animal, and it could affect our food supply, the farmer's livelihood, and then pose risks to animal health. So, under this bill, the Commissioner of Agriculture can step in, and both the Commissioner of Agriculture and the state veterinarian, in theory, are well positioned to know both the industry effects, the animal, the impacts on animals, and the risk to human health as well. So, we are happy to see that one pass this year. Next bill, please. Senate Bill 172 is a PSC bill, or an energy related bill. This bill makes a pretty practical change to how utility costs show up on people's bills. It will allow the Public Service Commission, or PSC, when it's reviewing a utility's fuel costs, to spread those costs out over a longer period of time instead of allowing them to pass through all at once. KRC supports this bill because it helps protect ratepayers against volatility. The biggest long-term issue is still the rising cost of fuels, like gas and coal. But in the short term, what really hits people and hurts them is the sudden spike in costs. So when the fuel costs jump, that can show up as a sharp increase in the monthly bill. And for a lot of Kentuckians, especially those who are already dealing with higher utility bills and tight budgets, even a modest and unexpected increase can be pretty hard for them to absorb. So it could also mean they could fall behind or even risk disconnection. So what this bill does is give the PSC a tool to kind of smooth those increases out instead of the big swings to month. And so we appreciate the stability and the predictability and billing that this can help with.
The next bill we're going to talk about is House Bill 214, which gives the Kentucky Department of Agriculture more flexibility by allowing it to accept funding from non-federal sources, both public and private, to support its programs. We supported this as a practical way to expand the department's resources and help it respond more quickly to emerging needs without having to rely solely on federal funds. Before headed to the governor, the bill was amended to include the substance of another bill that creates the Kentucky Urban Youth Agriculture Initiative, sponsored by Representative Kilcarney. This program is designed to introduce young people in urban areas to farming and agribusiness, starting with a pilot through the University of Kentucky Extension Office. The idea is to give kids hands-on experience like internships and apprenticeships while teaching them about efficient land use and agricultural practices in an urban setting. We really supported this effort because it helps build agricultural literacy, workforce skills, and a stronger connection to how our food systems and land are managed over the long term. So we were really glad to see this get added. Next bill.
The next slide is actually, we're going to talk about two bills, actually one bill and then one joint resolution. Senate Bill 651 and House Joint Resolution 81 together represent a collection of bills that are focused on strengthening our water infrastructure through the Waters program, which was created last session, and it was designed to help struggling water and wastewater systems. We're putting this in the good category because it's building on the foundation of last year in a very meaningful way. 651 is updating the eligibility rules, so that the program can better reach systems that really need support, especially in rural communities. And KRC last year worked with the sponsors on the framework to make sure that it could run and operate in a smooth way. So we're excited to see the expansion and the improvement this year. So alongside 651 is House Joint Resolution 81. It unlocks 53.4 million that had already been set aside, and allowing those funds to now go through the Kentucky Infrastructure Authority for the Waters program instead of sitting unused. So taken together, these bills represent a real investment in critical water infrastructure. And like any program that receives an influx of cash, there are always questions about how those funds are going to be used effectively and whether those dollars are being spent wisely. And that's something that we have to keep a close eye on. So in Martin County, for example, we know that a coalition of citizens and community groups, including a close ally, the Appalachian Citizens Law Center, are actively monitoring these funds and how they're being used. And so we really appreciate having excellent partners on the ground who are doing that work. But again, overall, we support these two bills. And our main point going forward is that water affordability also remains a real challenge along with the affordability of other utilities. And the state should continue building off this type of framework by also providing direct support for people who are struggling to pay their water bills and not just the wastewater infrastructure plants themselves.
Thanks. So the next is a Senate Resolution 192. It's a simple resolution, but it endorses the Ohio River Restoration Program Act, which has been introduced by Congressman McGarvey and others. The resolution recognizes the importance of this federal bill to the state of Kentucky by protecting our drinking water supplies, strengthening the economy, and protecting the ecological health of the Ohio River Basin. We want to recognize our allies at the Kentucky Waterways Alliance, who have been working on these issues and this resolution. Next.
Also, two more bills that we're building off the foundation from last year related to disaster resilience are House Bill 281 and House Bill 767. They're aimed directly at responding to natural disasters. House Bill 281 basically says that certain food donors won't be held liable or required to get licensed when they're trying to help people in need. And this would include nonprofits or religious organizations as long as they have 501c3 status. And as well as home-based food producers. And this is as long as the food is going to a homeless shelter or to people who have been displaced by a declared natural disaster. House Bill 767 would have the Division of Emergency Management create a statewide system called the Kentucky Qualification System to standardize training, certification, and credentialing for people who are involved in disaster response. So that includes with folks who are working on incident management teams and in the emergency operation centers. And the goal of this is to make sure that everyone is trained and is using the same standards and prepared to respond effectively. Generally, we support this type of consistency and reinforcing our community's ability to respond to natural disasters or their capacity to respond to natural disasters. At the same time, we want to be careful that the system doesn't intentionally create barriers for smaller or rural communities that may not have the same resources to get these folks through training. And it's also important to look at these two bills in context. You know, Kentucky has been experiencing some devastating floods and other natural disasters in recent years, which really underscores the growing impacts of climate change on our state. And the Disaster Resiliency Task Force, which was created last year, was a meaningful step to addressing those challenges by looking at both the issues and what Kentucky can do in terms of next steps to move forward to strengthen our resiliency. And this bill would build on that work in positive ways, you know, if we were to continue the Disaster Resiliency Task Force. But also, we need to be aware of the bigger picture here. The state should really be doing more proactive work to reduce the risks from natural disaster and lessen the severity of future impacts instead of just focusing on response. This next bill, before I get into the details, it's House Bill 677. I do want to flag this because this is a bill that KRC, through Tom Fitzgerald, had worked on for a very long time. And it was also amended late in the session to include some problematic provisions related to the siting of merchant solar and wind facilities, which Ashley will be discussing later. So, but before we, so that's, I just want to point that out. There are going to be some other parts of this bill that we're going to address. But what I'm going to address here is the carbon capture and sequestration, or the CCS part of this bill. And it probably helps to understand what we're talking about here. Carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, is a process where carbon dioxide is usually taken from industrial sources, captured, and then injected deep into underground rock formations for long-term storage. These are called Class 6 injection wells. And the idea is to keep carbon out of the atmosphere. Like I mentioned, this is a piece of consensus legislation that came out of the Oil and Gas Work Group. KRC was represented by Tom Fitzgerald on that group, and it's the product of years of hard work and negotiation. So one of the most important parts of this bill is that it's actually creating a permitting structure for these types of projects, and then it's requiring companies to prove upfront and on an ongoing basis that they have the financial resources to handle the project safely, and that they also have to monitor the site and maintain the well integrity and respond to any issues. And then they have to deal with the covering the long-term closure costs and the post-injection care of the land. So at the end of the day, this bill, at least this portion of the bill, strikes a nice balance. It allows for economic investment in carbon storage, but it also is putting some safeguards in place to protect groundwater, landowners, and the public. This next bill, House Bill 869, was one that passed at the very last minute. We're also going to briefly mention this one later in relation to House Bill 677. But this is one of several bills that was enacted the last day of session, and it contains numerous revisions to existing state laws relating to economic development and other legislative issues. But under the good is a provision in this bill that creates a new tax credit for the manufacture of and for the sale by commercial airports of alternative jet fuel, which is derived from agricultural or biomass. And the most important part, and this requirement that it's achieving at least 50% life cycle reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the petroleum-based jet fuel. So emissions from air travel are a growing and significant source of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So this makes it important to find alternatives, and we're glad to see that type of tax credit here in the state.
Great, thanks, Audrey. So the next one is Senate Bill 29. And this bill deals with who can regulate and charge fees for solid waste. So this bill prevents a county or waste district from imposing an assessment fee, permitting requirement, or other authorization requirement on a solid waste management facility located outside of that county or waste management district. After concerns voiced by KRC, this bill was amended to clarify that it doesn't impact the ability of a county to execute franchises or contracts with solid waste management companies outside of the county. While KRC had concerns originally that this bill might be misunderstood to affect the county's authority over solid waste generated in or imported into the county for management, the bill became a vehicle for a very positive amendment when House Bill 108 was added to the bill. House Bill 108, which was drafted by KRC at the request of Representative Raymer, closes a loophole by limiting the exclusion from solid waste planning for what we call captive residual landfills that are owned and operated by a company accepting only waste from that company to landfills located at or adjacent to the manufacturing facility. So this is kind of a wonky one dealing with solid waste, I know, but overall it's a good bill because the power of counties to regulate these out of state wastes from a negative perspective is limited. But local control over these captive industrial landfills is expanded. So. Okay, I just want to talk about Senate Bill 8. And the next few bills we're going to be discussing still fall under the good category of bills we ultimately supported because overall they are good bills. But there are ones where we do continue to have some concerns that we'll be pointing out. And so you'll see that these are marked in purple. So Senate Bill 8 changes the member and eligibility requirements for the Kentucky Public Service Commission, which is the agency charged with regulating more than 1,100 utilities across the state. It expands the PSC from 3 to 5 commissioners. And it also expands the Kentucky State Board on Electric Generation and Transmission Siting from 7 to 9 members. It also establishes certain qualifications for PSC commissioners, among many other provisions. A key point here, though, is the governor will continue to make all of the appointments to the commission, which was an issue we're concerned about. We're really keeping this one in the generally good section because we supported it really after so many bad provisions were ultimately taken out, including language in the original bill that would have significantly limited public interest intervention on behalf of residential ratepayers, which I'll be discussing later. The final bill also did not give the state auditor the authority to appoint any PSC commissioners, which was something we were concerned about. And it didn't affect existing law regarding when transmission line extensions require a certificate of need from the PSC. So the version that ultimately passed is focused on restructuring and expanding the PSC, but without a lot of these more negative provisions. It also gives the commission, greater administrative independence, including control over its personnel and procurement, which we see as positives. KRC supports the expansion of membership of the PSC, given its workload and long-standing resource constraints. But I do want to add here at the end that, we believe the PSC's mission would actually be better strengthened if instead we invested in more technical staff. Those are the people that are have this high level of expertise. They're the PSC staff, that are going through all of the reports and helping to really ensure all those documents are understood during the hearing. So again, for that reason, we talk about this as still a little bit of a mixed bag. Audrey?
The next good but mixed bill is Senate Bill 222. And this bill updates the rules around sites that have environmental covenants that restrict the land use of the property based on the release of a hazardous constituent on the site. So the key change here is how this restriction, this covenant, this environmental covenant and land use restrictions can be lifted. Right now in the KRS, removing a covenant typically requires the agreement from the original landowner and a few other parties. There could be other parties that also sign the original agreement with the cabinet, with the government. This bill would allow the current landowner, which might not necessarily be the original signer to the covenant, and the cabinet to remove those restrictions if the cabinet determines that they're no longer necessary because the land has been or is being remediated based on an approved environmental corrective action plan. The original parties would still need to be notified. The original parties to the covenant would still need to be notified and would have the opportunity to challenge the decision. So generally, this bill is falling under the good category because KRC generally supports the idea of redeveloping properties so that they can be put back into productive use and contribute to the surrounding communities. At the same time, though, KRC wants to be clear that the cleanup portion is essential. The land that's been contaminated and then has, subsequent restrictions put into place needs to actually be cleaned up before we are lifting some of the restrictions that were created by the covenant. And so we would encourage that the lift is also accompanied with strong and well-supported evidence that the site has actually been properly remediated. We also think that notice provisions could go further. In addition to the parties who need to be notified from the property, by the property itself, or the covenant being lifted from the property. It should also be posted for nearby neighbors, particularly those who are directly adjacent to the property. They should also have a chance to understand potential impacts, especially if, unfortunately, if a site weren't properly remediated or the plan was not comprehensive enough and could impact their properties and their property value, they should also be notified. We are going to keep this, considering that we're aware of, potential how this could be used in the future, and we want to make sure that we're safeguarding decisions, or at least safeguarding the local community's authority in that decision making process. We're going to be keeping an eye on this bill and how it's actually implemented in practice. The legislature's, like Ashley mentioned, this was a long session, 60 days. And that's in part because it's a budget year. And House Bill 500 is the legislature's 2-year executive branch budget. And it ended up directing about $32 billion to the state, to state spending across the 2 years from 2026 to 2028. The main trend was that there was fiscal restraint. And it included some across the board cuts to many agencies. And there were also, this also went hand in hand with some targeted investments in conservation districts, for example, and dam rehabilitation, and some energy initiatives, like nuclear energy, for example. The Energy and Environment Cabinet continued to receive funding in the biennial budget, But this is when we look at the budget, we're also talking about a broader context of constrained agency resources, and it raises concerns generally about whether the funding levels are sufficient to adequately support expanded responsibilities within the cabinet. House Bill 500 left roughly 345 million unspent for the next 2 years, which would be deposited into the budget reserve trust fund, which is currently at $3.7 billion until House Bill 900 passed, which actually supplements the budget by directing 1.7 billion from the budget reserve trust fund towards one-time investments. Some of these included water and sewer infrastructure projects, specific economic development projects and local projects, and then also provided a significant infusion of funding, but largely through discretionary and project by project based allocations rather than long term and systemic investment that we would see within, possibly within House Bill 500.
Oh, I was on mute. Okay, we are now moving on to the bad. Legislation that weakens environmental protection, limits local authority, or undermines justice and equity, among other concerns. And there was a lot of bad legislation this year. As you'll hear at the end, some of it we, didn't pass. But we're gonna address, many of the bills that we had significant concerns with under the bad. This first bill is complicated. It's, if you'll see, I've put the explanation under purple because to some extent this is these bills that we'll be talking about are a mixed bag. But what the bad outcome here is that together they're creating new barriers to some clean energy projects. House Bill 677 is the oil and gas working group bill that got mentioned. This is the provisions, these setback and height limits for wind and solar are things that got added at the very last minute into the process without our input. And frankly, blindsided us a little bit at the beginning. Because of that, it made it difficult to figure out, kind of how to best engage and respond as all of this happened very quickly. And, we reached out to several partner groups and, worked hard to understand the various, aspects of these provisions. And as things evolved, and we're continuing to have those conversations. KRC believes that many of the provisions in House Bill 677 protect landowners, but recognize that others may pose barriers to some clean energy projects and far exceed the setbacks that we believe are appropriate or needed, particularly for solar projects, which is why we're discussing this under the bad today. One of the biggest changes is around those setbacks. So for both merchant and utility solar and wind power, these are those merchant facilities are ones that are selling power onto the grid. Under existing law, there is already a 2,000-foot setback from things like neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals. But HB 677 expanded this setback to include structures or facilities used in connection with the generation and those used for storage, such as battery energy storage systems. It also added a new 1,000-foot setback from property lines for utility scale projects, which was a significant increase. As I mentioned, we have generally supported setbacks for utility scale projects in order to protect landowners. But like in our model ordinance, for example, we've recommended setbacks of 100 feet to existing residences and 50 feet from property lines. So we're talking about much further setbacks. And also, many of the setbacks in the current law were designed to address fossil fuel merchant power plants with emissions. So again, we feel that these setbacks are in excess of what's necessary for solar, which is also evident from the fact that the siting board routinely waives these setbacks. But one of the more troubling aspects of the bill was a hard height cap limit for new wind projects at 350 feet. And I mean, and this is tall. It's the height of the Statue of Liberty, right? But with all of this new technology, we are and it's expanding so quickly, we are seeing new turbines that are often much taller because they're able to capture more wind. And we think that what that provision was probably directly aimed at a project in Henderson that I think those turbines were estimated to be more like 700 or 800 feet. Um, right now, a lot of these decisions gets made on a case by case basis, which is a better, more flexible approach. We actually think that 350-foot height cap is actually still waivable under the law by the siting board. So hopefully that is the case. This bill does include some positive changes on decommissioning. It strengthens protections for landowners by requiring that land be more fully restored when a project is taken offline and gives current landowners a better say in terms of what gets removed. It also makes sure companies can't reduce their financial obligations based upon project salvage value. Although we also understand that some wind and solar developers have some significant concerns about that provision, and we're working to understand that issue with better clarity. I also want to add some of these requirements were scaled back in House Bill 869. It amended HB 677 by removing storage from the setback provisions applicable to merchant power plants. But it also unfortunately, removed the requirement that restoration include the same or similar soil quality before construction. So, ultimately on this issue, we think there really needs to be a comprehensive multi-stakeholder conversation on the impact of setbacks and height limits on the development of modern solar and wind generation in Kentucky, and how better to utilize mitigation rather than hard setback limits to assure efficient land utilization while respecting the rights of neighboring landowners. So we're starting to already have those conversations with some partner groups and are looking forward to continuing those conversations. And I realize we're I think almost at the halfway point, or a little over. I'm going to try to go through some of these more quickly. Audrey, maybe we can run through some of these. House Bill 111 takes a broad approach to animal care on farms. It says that decisions about on-farm animal health care and animal health production practices are left solely to the farmer or livestock owner, even if other laws might say otherwise. And it makes consulting with the veterinarian about about animal health optional. It does carve out horses and makes clear that state and federal officials can still do their duties, kind of going back to the earlier bill that Audrey discussed regarding emergencies. But we have concerns. I think this is written and the terms are not defined. So we are concerned that this leaves a lot of uncertainty about how it's going to fit with existing like environmental protections and animal welfare standards. And so we have this under the bed because we feel like it falls into a broader trend of trying to limit outside oversight of concentrated animal feeding operations, even as standards around environmental protection and animal welfare continue to evolve. Okay, Audrey, 398.
House Bill 398 is dealing with who pays for the cost of retiring fossil fuel power plants and when. To give a little context, over the past couple of years, the legislature has passed laws that are actually making it harder for utilities to retire coal-generated units, coal generating units. There's now a presumption against retiring those plants when the utilities are going in front of the Public Service Commission, for example, and asking if they can do so. So since then, the PSC has generally said that utilities can't start charging customers the retirement costs until the plant is actually approved to retire. But this bill would change that. House Bill 398 allows utilities to start recovering, or at least to start seeking recovery of costs associated with decommissioning before the plant is even approved for retirement. So instead of waiting for a decision to be made, customers could, in theory, start paying for the cost in advance. And of course, there's a bit of a tension here. On one hand, allowing earlier cost recovery could make it easier, in theory, to retire a fossil fuel plant sooner. But on the other hand, under the current legal framework, there's not a guarantee that those retirements will actually be approved. So in the meantime, customers could be paying for something that may not happen. KRC opposes this because any shift of financial risk away from utilities and onto the ratepayers is against, kind of the core part of our mission, protecting residential ratepayers, but also cuts up against the legislature in terms of what they've said and upheld in earlier laws. So
So the next bill is House Bill 542, which deals with eminent domain, specifically when conservation easements or agricultural districts are involved. And I think, all of us have been concerned about the broad right of eminent domain given to particularly utilities. We've seen that with Bernheim Forest. We saw it with Berea College, even though Berea just had a very good win, which was great. These are issues that need to be addressed. And on its face, the bill is trying to add some protections. It includes things like limits on misleading negotiation practices, requiring appraisals before the condemnation can move forward, and adding in some notice and transparency requirements. And so some positives. But we have this in the bad section because we just have significant concerns that made it where we just could not support the bill. The biggest issue is that the bill actually may limit a landowner's ability to argue that a taking is not necessary. Under current law, landowners can push back and say, there is a better alternative. You do not need to take my property. And the bill weakens that argument in certain important cases, especially for land under conservation easements, which is exactly where you'd want strong protections. We obviously support fair and transparent eminent domain processes, but and this bill takes a few steps in the right direction, but it takes some big steps back. So overall, is a bad bill, we felt like. Audrey?
House Bill 607 is a pretty wide-ranging bill, and it actually makes a number of changes to how consolidated local governments operate. It ends up touching on things like ethics commissions, redistricting, internal audits, and city and corporation rules and property tax structures. But the piece that KRC is most concerned about, and why we are flagging this as bad, has to do with the environmental and public health regulations. Specifically, this bill allows a consolidated local government council to override rules issued by a local health department or a solid waste management board, and within 45 days. So this shift reduces the autonomy of these specialized boards that are actually designed to make technical and environmental decisions based on their subject matter expertise. And it's also introducing a layer of political oversight onto health and environmental rulemaking at a local level, which is representing a significant state restructuring of local regulatory systems and function, and KRC tends to promote local control and authority. Next slide, please. House Bill 757 was also a bill that kind of came out and was debated late in the session. It's a bit of a grab bag bill. There are wide-ranging changes to Kentucky tax law and local government rules, but it's also touching on things like sales and excise tax and tax incentives, things of note, like things like that. But one of the most notable pieces is actually the creation of this new category of municipal interlocal gas utilities. And these are essentially partnerships between cities where they are agreeing to build and operate a natural gas system. And under this bill, they're actually, despite the term, they're treated as special purpose government entities rather than traditional utilities. So that means that they're not regulated in the same way, and that they can extend, in kind of a non-traditional way, extend gas service beyond city boundaries. So this bill is actually really aimed at supporting a particular project in Western Kentucky, where a few cities have formed the Pennyrile Regional Energy Agency, PREA, in other words. And this is to build a natural gas pipeline, and it's primarily to serve, or at least the external mission says that it's primarily to serve Fort Campbell. And in the area, there's been ongoing dispute about whether PREA should be regulated by the Public Service Commission. And this bill, essentially answers that question by exempting it from PSC oversight in some ways, because it's considered a special purpose entity. So, and this bill has gone back and forth. There are a couple different changes here, and it gets kind of complicated. But there is one section that appears to prohibit a new entity, or there's one section that appears to prohibit this, PREA from serving residential customers along the pipeline. But in another provision in the bill, it actually could possibly allow PREA to serve those customers. However, those customers wouldn't get the guarantee of reliable service, in part because the body of law that this is written under was designed for gas wells and small gathering lines, not large pipelines like this one. So depending on how it's interpreted, it could either allow nearby landowners to tap into the pipeline, um, but either way, under existing law, those customers could get access, but they might not have the same protections around reliability that traditional utility customers do. So overall, the bill covers a lot of ground, but this new structure raises some important questions about oversight and customer protections and how this type of system, this special system, could actually function in practice. Um, the next topic is nuclear energy, and we're combining conversation on Senate Bill 57 and Senate Concurrent Resolution 66. Nuclear energy has been making a renaissance, not only in Kentucky, but across the nation for the past several years. And these measures reflect Kentucky's push to position our state as, position nuclear energy as a central component of our energy strategy as a state. So, Senate Bill 57 probably represents the most significant shift. It establishes the nuclear reactor site readiness program, and it authorizes substantial state subsidies for early site permitting, and it actually allows utilities to seek cost recovery from ratepayers, for some of these development expenses, even when the project is not ultimately constructed. This approach ends up raising some serious concerns. This bill is allowing a utility to seek recovery of speculative permitting and licensing costs outside a traditional rate making safeguard because there's a notwithstanding clause that precedes the heart of this section. And this bill ends up departing from longstanding principles that require new generation to be proved necessary and least cost, and also a principle called the used and useful principle, so that before ratepayers are bearing the financial burden, it has to be used and useful to them. In effect, it shifts significant financial risk onto the public while not offering the same guarantee of corresponding benefit to the public. And at the same time, the bill is also expanding the Kentucky Nuclear Energy Development Authority, so that this body is becoming more of an active promoter of nuclear development. And they're actually submitting in terms of who's going to receive a grant through this program, they're submitting, an industry group essentially who's submitting the eligibility criteria and their proposed awards to the General Assembly, who will then approve the final award. The Senate Concurrent Resolution 66 ends up
Sorry.
complementing the nuclear trend. Sorry, I'll go really fast. This is basically just encouraging Kentucky's public universities to align with federal nuclear initiatives and then to expand the workforce development pipeline tied to the industry. I'm not going to go into much more detail than that for the sake of time, but taken together, this is signaling a coordinated policy step towards actually advancing nuclear energy, in our state, primarily through public subsidies and institutional alignment. But we remain concerned that this approach and prioritizing speed, like we are right now, is premature. And really, the industry and some of the problems that remain with long-term, environmental stewardship issues and long-term waste management, those need careful evaluation first before we start doing this and forcing ratepayers to pay the cost. The next bill is Senate Bill 100. And this bill expands the role and capacity of EPIC, the Energy Planning and Inventory Commission. EPIC was created a couple of sessions ago, and it's involved in studying how coal is used in Kentucky, and then ultimately, promoting it. But when a utility wants to retire a coal-fired power plant, EPIC can weigh in via the executive committee or executive director by preparing a report for the Public Service Commission, and the PSC then has to consider that as part of the decision-making process. EPIC also is charged with compiling a report that they send to the legislature and the General Assembly and the Public Service Commission and the executive branch at the end of the year. That report has yet to be filed. But this is making some significant changes to how EPIC was set up and operates. It's essentially just expanding operational capacity. The concern that we had at the very beginning was that we are expanding on a problematic entity, but also the original version of the bill raised some serious red flags because it could have shielded much of Epic's work from public view by creating what could be read as a blanket exemption from Kentucky's Open Records Act. We were able to negotiate that out of the bill, fortunately, but we still disagree with the creation and expansion of Epic.
I'm going to go ahead and Audrey, since we're I think running short on time here. I'm going to fly through a little bit of the missed opportunities, and I'll let you, Audrey, just mention Bray's bill. But there, as always, every year there are bills that you see that are filed that would have improved the health of Kentucky's environment communities and that were not passed. Regulation of data centers is a big one there. We're seeing these data centers proposed in communities throughout the Commonwealth. And so there was a number of bills that addressed things from, making sure that, counties can't use non-disclosure agreements to keep information from the public. Creating requirements to ensure that these data centers, if they come, are not going to put an unreasonable. I mean, we know they're going to put a large load, but making sure that they pay for it instead of ratepayers. Audrey, you want to just briefly mention Bray's bill that we were that was
Yeah,
one particular one, yeah.
that's at the heart. Actually, what Ashley just mentioned is at the heart of Bray's bill. It's really the Public Service Commission when they're regulating, data centers or providing electricity to data centers. They're making sure that there are going to be contracts in place that are, that include comprehensive tariffs and application processes, so that we're ensuring that data centers are the ones who, when they are being served energy and we have to generate more energy in order to serve them, they're also the ones who are footing the bill without shifting the cost or degrading service for other customers.
Yeah.
We have, KRC is a different and advocated for a different approach to to data center regulation. However, it would complement the approach that was taken in Bray's bill. Another missed opportunity, very quickly, has to do with how with affordability, with utility affordability. Senate Joint Resolution directed the Kentucky Public Service Commission to open one or more, administrative cases to examine how the Commonwealth can better ensure the affordability and continuity of essential utility services. But there was a special focus on low and fixed income households. It made it to the very end of the of the session. It made it to the other house, or it made it to the House, excuse me, the other chamber, but unfortunately it did not pass. And so we'd like to see something like this come back next year.
And of course, I mean, there's, issues related to PFAS. There was a bill that would have established a healthy soils program. We wanted to see more on disaster prevention and resiliency, and of course, affordable housing. And none of those good bills ended up making it very far, and they were issues that unfortunately our legislature didn't address, appropriately this session. So we want to at least talk about a little bit of good again, the good news on bad bills. So these are bills that would have weakened environmental protections or undermined justice and equity, but failed to pass. And we'll go through these really quickly. But Senate Bill 8 was a big one. It was Senate Bill 8, as it was originated, really targeted the work of Kentucky Resources Council and our clients in intervening in cases before the Kentucky Public Service Commission. It would have significantly restricted participation by advocates for residential ratepayers in PSC cases. It provided that when the Attorney General intervenes in a case, that office would be the sole advocate for residential customers. In practice, because the Attorney General intervenes in most rate and other PSC cases, this language would have effectively barred nonprofit organizations representing residential ratepayers from participating in most PSC proceedings. As you can imagine, the utilities are not always happy about our participation. Our attorney, Byron Gary, dives into the facts and modeling. He asks hard questions. The joint interveners hire experts to analyze and sometimes challenge the utilities premises for why they want to raise rates or build a new gas plant. For the most part, this section would have prevented intervention. The good news is that we fought back really fast and really hard. Audrey Ernstberger and Metropolitan Housing Coalitions. Tony Curtis gave testimony before the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and the joint interveners sent letters. You all also helped us. I know we got, I think, hundreds of emails flooded in, and we're able to, KRC and other allies were able to work with the sponsor to get that language removed. So that was a big win. Audrey, want to just briefly mention permitting reform?
Very quickly, this one was the goal of this bill was to accelerate permitting and licensing. And it would have applied to all public agencies. The final version only applied to state agencies, but it would restrict permitting decisions to criteria where there's a clear and unambiguously established in statute or regulation, a basis for denials. And so it would require clear criteria and that's unambiguously established in statute in order to approve a permit. And then it would prohibit a denial based on unauthorized factors, i.e., for any reason that's not then codified. And then would have directed the courts to resolve the ambiguity without deference to the agency. By the end, there were several iterations, but by the end, Kentucky Resources Council, we still could not support it because it had a very restrictive 60-day time frame for agency action. And then if the agency didn't act, there would be an automatic permit issued without technical review. So we were happy to see this type of permitting reform die, especially without tolling language, where it could create the conditions for the time clock to be manipulated and then run out, and a permit then be automatically issued without the appropriate review. So that's all I'm going to say for the sake of time. But 178 was, if it had passed, would have been one of our ugly bills, but we were very happy it did not, that it died. So we are putting it in the good category for that reason. This bill did get a hearing in the Senate Natural Resources Committee, but then was recommitted there, where ultimately it died. And that could tell you something about how it was received in the Senate. So this bill would have significantly limited the state's ability to pass new environmental regulations. And we all know how important that those regulations are. They're what allow the Energy and Environment Cabinet to monitor pollution and enforce the law and then hold polluters accountable. So substantively, the bill would have prevented the Energy and Environment Cabinet and also the Cabinet for Health and Family Services from adopting any environmental regulations that are more stringent than the federal standards on the same or a substantially similar topic. And when there isn't a federal standard, the bill would set an extremely high bar. It would require regulations to be backed by what it calls best available science and the weight of scientific evidence, and to be technologically achievable at a practical scale. That might sound reasonable at first. A lot of these concepts are familiar or sound great. We already see them in federal law in some cases, but here in the state law that was proposed, they were defined so broadly and so rigidly that in combination with one another, they actually become limiting rather than helpful. So instead of allowing agencies to act based on credible risk, for example, as we would typically allow under a precautionary approach, the bill would require near conclusive proof of harm before any action is taken. And a really good example of this is another provision in the bill that when it comes to public health protections, for any regulation that is promulgated for the reason of protecting human health or safety, the bill would have required a direct causal link between the exposure and then actual measurable bodily harm in humans. Again, that's really high, and it's frankly unrealistic and bad public policy because it's shifting us away from preventing harm proactively and toward waiting for harm until it's already happened. So that's how it gained the label, the body count bill, in the middle of session.
I just want to quickly add about Audrey. I think for time, just to what Audrey said about 178, because I really do believe it was the advocacy of KRC and our allies, including Kentucky Conservation Committee, Kentucky Waterways Alliance, and Kentucky Sierra Club, that really helped stop this. And you, of course, within 48 hours of this bill being filed, our coalition had met to strategize. KRC had published a detailed fact sheet addressing the issues, and we'd put out an alert. Audrey testified on this bill along with Dr. Aaron Haynes from UK's College of Health and a colleague from Kentucky Waterways Alliance. We know many of you made calls. We had 546 people use our action alert to send more than 11,000 emails to legislators. Kentucky Sierra Club and other groups had people call in. And, I really feel like this built on that momentum that we had last year with Senate Bill 89, and as we talked about on the Zoom last year, that response was really powerful. And so, I feel like the voices resonated again this session. And, all lawmakers even told us, we're starting to get hundreds of calls on this bill. And so we were really glad to see it stopped. That said, we know that something like it may show up again next session. There's a question in the chat about what the public can do during the interim session to communicate with legislatures on these kinds of bills, which is a great question. And I think it is, if you can go in during the interim and meet with your legislator, talk to them about, some of the issues that you saw this session. Send emails in the off session when things are not so crazy. But we will definitely be keeping you all up to date, as things move forward during the interim. But I want to end, and so just we have a time for a couple of questions on what we thought was the ugliest bill of the session. We always say for the ugly laws that not only take us backwards, but may violate the Constitution or jeopardize the health and safety of Kentuckians. This year, we felt that bill was SB 199. The pesticide manufacturer immunity bill that limits protections for farmers and consumers. Senate Bill 199 amends Kentucky law so that an EPA-approved label for any pesticide product would be the limit of a manufacturer's legal duty to inform users about risks, such as potential cancer or health hazards. The bill makes it more difficult for farmers, farm workers, and even household consumers from seeking justice when they are exposed to products containing pesticides with an EPA approved label. Because those labels are not actually required to disclose, a lot of the hazards and the chronic health conditions. Really what SB does is step in before. Right now, there's actually a case working its way through that's before the Supreme Court that looks at the question about whether federal pesticide labels should override state law claims when those labels fail to warn about risks. And this bill really steps in before that question is resolved. And is part of a broader state trend. We really were seeing this. This bill has been repeated in many states across the United States, and there's even a similar provision that is currently in the federal farm bill. This bill was vetoed by our governor, but that veto was overridden, so it is now law. From our perspective, this is a significant shift that tilts the balance away from protecting, people and workers and consumers, and instead shield manufacturers from liability. So.